So first we're going to talk about integrated pest management, IPM, or plant health care. This is the first portion of our presentations on this. So IPM takes a holistic approach that emphasizes plant health. It takes an ecosystem approach, and it emphasizes working with nature. Integrated is using a mixture of science-based methods to protect plants or sites from pests. So you're not using just one tool. It's very likely you're going to need to use a number of tools to get control or manage a pest. And of course, a pest is insects, mites, pathogens, weeds, etc. We are going to focus primarily on insects, mites, and pathogens in this class. And then management is this planned, systematic way to manage populations for damage below a predetermined level. And it's systematic. You're going to try something and then you're going to monitor to make sure it worked. If that didn't work, then you go back and try something else, etc. You need to have a biology of the pest you're dealing with and what kind of interaction it has with hosts or natural enemies as well as competitors. And think about what the weather and condition of the site does to affect the pest. Is it encouraging a pest? If it's hot and dry, mites are going to be a real problem. Are there beneficial organisms in the area? And have you established an economic or aesthetic threshold? So first you want to identify and list all the plants on the site, especially things that are showing damage. Study the ecosystem of the site. Look at where the wind is coming from, what the sun exposure is, what the drainage is like. And then if you can, you try to manipulate conditions, so perhaps you need to do some pruning to allow some good airflow. You want to identify key pests and understand their biology. And what we're probably going to see most of all out there are damage symptoms and signs for each pest. Quite often you don't see the pest. They may be long gone. You're going to establish monitoring guidelines for each pest and then monitor for natural enemies. And here we have a ladybird beetle eating some aphids. This is the larva. You want to correctly identify the pests. So we've got a pest on the lower left corner here, a brown marmorated stink bug becoming a problem in the Pacific Northwest, feeding on fruits. And an assassin bug is actually a beneficial insect, and it actually will pierce and suck the guts out of a pest insect. So a good thing to have in your garden. You want to know the pest life cycles. You want to monitor, just make sure it's causing damage, and then when do you manage? Is the pest threatening the survival of the plant? In the case of deciduous material, quite often if an insect is, especially a chewing insect, is feeding on leaves, you could lose 25% of your foliage and the plant's going to make a comeback. So you need to monitor, and doing that, here we have an apple maggot trap, and they're going to be attracted to the red for the apples, but the yellow is kind of a landing spot. So if they're flying in the area, they will land on that and stick to it. So it's a larger surface area in which to see if you've got apple maggot. Unfortunately, you're not going to get a lot of control on this, but it's good to know when they're in the area. So thresholds include the economic threshold, population level at which serious damage or crop losses occur. This is especially important in agriculture and in greenhouse nursery. Aesthetic threshold, that's usually found to be an issue when you're talking about the landscape level, when you're at people's houses, and the damage may be unacceptable to the viewer, even if the plant health isn't at risk. So it's up to you to communicate that to your client before they require you to break out the pesticides. So if you took broadleaf evergreens from me in the fall, you know boxwood is very prone to boxwood psyllid. And here's what the damage looks like. And in a landscape, this isn't a problem. Of course, this could be challenging to sell if you're in a nursery situation, but if you're in a landscape situation, you're not going to be able to really manage this pest. You could try shearing it out, but it's probably going to come back. It's really not threatening the life of the plant. Here's chrysanthemum leaf miner damage, and the insect is actually inside that trail you see there. And this cannot be sold. This is not a good plant to sell at a nursery. So here's your economic threshold. It should happen before this happens. You should be on the lookout for whatever insect caused that. So methods include cultural control, mechanical or physical control, biological controls, and chemical controls. We'll talk about biological and chemical in the second presentation. So you want to start right, select plants that are adapted to the site you have in mind, right plant, right place. Avoid using pest-prone plants. This is Scammia japonica, and it's very prone to spider mites. And again, if you took broadleaf evergreens in the fall, we saw a lot of these out there. This is pretty typical for this plant. So, I would be less likely to plant something like that. Now, Acer rubrum is very tolerant of soils. It likes sun, it likes acid and moist conditions. It actually can occur in wet areas, hence the swamp maple name. But it's not necessarily very tolerant of urban conditions, and it develops surface roots, so that can be a problem. So depending on your situation, this could be the correct plant, or if you're in a street tree situation, you may want to try something else. Okay, here's rose black spot, very, very typical in our area. You're probably going to want to choose a resistant variety, and Pacific Northwest Disease Handbook has a great list of disease-resistant roses, and I will share that with you. However, if you've got a resistant plant next to one that is not resistant and is covered with black spot, chances are even the resistant plant will get it. There's just a lot of inoculum there. So when you're working with your soil, you want to look at your pH. Always a good idea to get a soil test. Make sure the plant you're trying to grow is suited to that pH. You can improve the physical properties of the soil by adding organic matter. You can improve soil fertility and soil organic matter by working compost into the soil or top dressing. And some things you can do to prevent pest buildup would be crop rotation. And when you rotate your crops, you're going to want to use a plant that is not in the same plant family. And you don't have to necessarily do this every year, but you should do it every couple of years. And then fallowing. Fallowing is just leaving the site, let it be. And then using resistant crop varieties and crops less susceptible to pests, as I mentioned with the roses. So pest resistance is when a plant has properties that prevent or impede disease development. We have Better Boy tomatoes here. They're resistant to verticillium wilt, fusarium, and root knot nematode. And we'll talk about all of these things as the quarter progresses. Pest tolerance is when you have a host that develops and continues to grow and produces well despite the pathogen being there. And Parkway Norway actually tolerates verticillium wilt. This is pretty unusual. Maple is one of the major trees that are susceptible to verticillium wilt. Of course, proper planting and maintenance. Here we have our volcano of mulch. When you have it piled up against the bark, it may begin to rot, causing further disease and insect problems. And even if it doesn't cause rot, it may actually develop secondary roots from the trunk, and they're prone to girdling the trunk. Okay, water management. Yeah, you want to make sure you're not overwatering your plants. That's going to just cause problems. So cultural controls include removing problem plants. This is white pine blister rust on the upper left on pine. That's the sign. That's the fruiting bodies. And then we've got Ribes sanguineum down below. That's the alternate host. So you need to remove one of these things, because if you eliminate the alternate host, you're going to be able to manage it. I would say that the white pine blister rust is bad enough on that white pine that you probably want to remove the white pine. Sanitation is really important, not leaving leaves and such that may have disease organisms on them over winter. You want to modify the environment, maybe increase drainage, increase airflow, etc. So sanitation means removing these leaves. Once the leaves fall to the ground, the fungus is just going to overwinter and restart again in the spring. So it's really, really important that you clean this up. Here's our black spot again. So the disease cycle begins on fallen leaves or canes that are previously infected, and rain or sprinkler irrigation splashes these fungal spores from infected leaves that have fallen. Sometimes they say if you lift up the canopy on the roses, you might be able to avoid anything that might be splashing back up on the plant. Sanitation includes removing diseased wood as soon as it becomes evident. Dispose of your prunings immediately to prevent them from becoming a source of new infections. Remove your stumps, brush piles, and debris. Brush thinnings and other debris harbor diseases as well as vertebrates and insects. You want to remove diseased shoots, leaves, and fruit on the ground, on trees and on the ground. And you're getting rid of this. You do not want to compost this stuff. Keep the tree crown area free of weeds to reduce crown rot infections. And then keep areas near virus-prone plants clear of weeds to reduce insects. Thrips in particular can live in weeds, and they are some of the worst vectors for viral diseases of plants. So you want to be careful about over-fertilization. Excessive use of fertilizers can kill plants, damage them as well. High levels of salt will damage the plant roots, and that will result in reduced water uptake, but it also causes salts to accumulate on leaf tissues, and you're going to see this dieback or necrosis of leaf margins. And you can see that this is totally an abiotic problem. It's really uniform in damage. Excessive nitrogen pushes less new growth, and problems that you might get are powdery mildew, mites, and aphids. They all love this new growth, so be careful about that. So you might consider planting some companion plants, because this can reduce the numbers of plant pests. It can enhance growth depending on what you're growing. And it can attract beneficials, and of course it can suppress weeds because it's providing competition. So mechanical controls include removal, traps, barriers, repellents. Copper tape is unpleasant for slugs and snails when they come in contact with it. It's kind of an expensive way to go, but it is something that works. And floating row covers can be put down to protect crops from pests such as carrot rust fly. Carrot rust fly can have up to 3 or 4 generations in a season, so you may not even be able to take your floating row cover off. And you can buy floating row cover that will allow light to come in, so you can still get photosynthesis happening. Okay, so here's on the left you've got a nice population of aphids on your roses here, but you can actually just hose off your aphids. It can be done. You want to keep ants off of plants. Ants actually protect aphids. They like the honeydew that they produce. They will actually fight off predator insects. So what you can do is you can apply Tanglefoot to trees, but you want to use some sort of fabric or something so you're not applying it directly to the trees. But a better thing might be using this irrigation Teflon tape, because ants will actually make little bridges of their dead bodies and climb over them. The Teflon tape is too slippery for them. And you can use a slug trap, and you can buy things like yeast products that go in them, but stale beer works really great. And you just set this in the soil, and you can actually make homemade traps for this as well.